Well, so we figured we might start, just because obviously this is a tragedy on so many levels, is just to sort of check in with folks. And, you know, that's a really heavy-duty movie to watch. And we realized that weirdly or sadly or something to be proud of or something to be grateful for, these are stories that we know. So for us, it's a tragedy, but it's not
Not shocking.
it's not a shocking tragedy at all, yeah. So we thought we would start by just sort of seeing how people are doing, and then we could talk a little bit about our thoughts. Any thoughts?
It just makes me ask the question, you know, can adoptive parents make any positive difference in the lives? I mean, my coworker's father was a foster parent for many years, and he's always telling me they all ended up just, you know, no matter what he did, they just, you know, the question is, you know, can they, you know, have a good life and turn out in a positive way through the foster parenting system or adoption?
That's a good question.
When they have so many, you know, genetically so many strikes against them.
Yep.
I think that you could say the same, though, about if you have your own biological children and you have a genetic predisposition toward mental health issues, that all your genetic children could have the same kinds of problems. So you're definitely taking a risk when you adopt children. You don't know what traumas they've been through and what genetics they always have. But I've known of many stories where they do turn out great. So it's definitely a gamble.
And there's a lot of research around, first of all, obviously her during the pregnancy, you know, she was getting an awful lot of alcohol, so she literally has brain damage. So, you know, that's a tough cookie, those kids that have drinkers for moms. And then the first 3 years of life are incredibly important. I mean, we're finding way more out about those first 3 years of life and the development of the brain. And it's scary, to be honest with you. I mean, some of those things, if there's a dissociation, it's real hard. The thing that I find interesting about Centoya, though, is, I don't know if you saw the difference between when she first started talking when she was 16 and when she was 18. She started to actually, she said she was developing a personality. She actually was. And they cut from the movie a letter she wrote. They couldn't get access to her when she actually went to prison. So she wrote a letter. And the letter was surprisingly full of life. Her life wasn't over. It actually had some hope. And not to say that anyone wants her to turn out that way or have that life, but even in this situation, I think we saw some, you know, when she started to get those light bulb moments and she started to draw those lines with the men, you know, that's a real thing. So I don't think we can ever write anybody off, you know, at whether we adopt or whether we're just in their lives in other ways. But there's a lot goes on those first couple of years.
I was also very impressed with the way that she changed and the connections that she made. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about what were the interventions at that stage? What were the things that made it more possible for her to start to unravel herself and, in a positive sense, to untie the knots?
Well, I've definitely seen prison as actually, in jail, is actually sometimes for some people who leave totally chaotic lives, right? Right out of the womb, there is chaos. Where I think, I look at her life and I think, I don't know how she got out of bed. You know, I mean, she didn't turn it internally. Some people would have killed themselves. She killed someone else, right? But I don't know how you function. That sometimes jail and prison and sort of that very structured life gives people a safe place. I mean, it was interesting, her attorney at one point during the trial said something like, she started the day she killed the person, thinking she was going to have a safe day, and she didn't. And I thought, oh no, she didn't start that day thinking she was going to have a safe day.
Right.
She hasn't had a safe day. Probably she could count on one hand.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in some strange way, sometimes that very structured, insular community Some people actually find some growth there, some sanity there, which is why, like, I always think, we can't think her life is over. Again, I don't wish this for her, but, you know, even though she's in prison, she still matters, she still counts, and she still has a life that is of value. And we can't sort of forget that.
And I think the other piece too is that she was, when she was out of jail and on the streets, and she was so pulled by other people to do this and that. So part of that was creating the chaos too. And she made some of her own choices, but a lot of it was being pressured into things. And a lot of young women that end up being sexually abused end up either in the industry of stripping or prostitution, things like that. And they're very confused about their own sexuality. And so it's not surprising that she ends up with this pimp, and who then is, threatening her life and so forth. So finally she's in prison, and now she doesn't have to fear that. So, and I think the other thing is, by the time we were seeing her later, she was 18. So her brain had started developing further as she was getting older. So she didn't have quite the same impulsivity that she probably had at 16. Now she was able to process things differently.
And she didn't have men in her life in the same way in prison, in jail.
Mm-hmm.